You ever feel like dropping everything and vanishing into the wilderness? Selling off all your possessions, saying bye-bye to society, and spending the rest of your life in solitude, just you and the forest. Well, that's exactly what a guy named John Tornow did a little over 100 years ago. And for a while at least, he was just another eccentric oddball living off the land. But sadly, the outside world just wouldn't let him be. Toss in a string of tragic deaths, wild rumors, and a family scandal so horrific that it defies belief, and Tornow soon found himself transformed from a mere loner into the wild man of the Wynoochee, a creature so feared that parents would whisper his name to their children just to keep him in line. But who was the real John Tornow? How'd a quiet farm kid turn into the most wanted man in all of the Pacific Northwest? How true are the stories about him escaping from the loony bin? Was Tornow really a cold-blooded monster, or simply misunderstood? Stick around and find out, because this one's going to get a little weird. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza.
Yeehaw!
Michael John Tornow was born in Iowa on September 4th, 1880. His parents, Frederick and Louisa, immigrated from Germany in the late 1860s, and once they arrived on American soil, they almost immediately began pushing west. First to Nebraska, then Iowa, where John was born, Oregon, and finally, Washington's Olympic Peninsula, not too far from the town of Aberdeen. All total, John would have 4 siblings, 3 boys and 1 girl, and out of all of them, he was the closest with his older sister, Minnie. Not only was she 14 years his elder, so almost like a second mother, but she was also the one that introduced him to the great outdoors. Apparently, they spent a lot of time in the backcountry just going on walks and exploring. Minnie would eventually get married when John was just 5 years old, but by that point, his love for the wilderness was already deeply ingrained. Weren't long before he began vanishing into the forest all on his own, for hours or sometimes even days at a time. As John grew older, these excursions would not only become much more frequent, but also longer in duration. And by the time he got to be an adult, he was already well on his way to becoming a local legend, or at very least, a neighborhood oddity. And he really was sort of an imposing figure. He was bearded, he stood over 6 feet tall, and of course, he was a recluse that spent all of his time out in the woods by himself. He also proved to be one hell of a marksman. According to those who knew him best, John could plug a can of snuff at 100 yards. Hell, even the local sheriff, who wasn't exactly known for doling out compliments, admitted that he'd never seen anyone who could handle a rifle like Tornow. Said that he, quote, never wastes a cartridge. If 20 deer tried to cross the road at full speed, he'd get them all at 200 yards, end of quote. Are these stories exaggerated? Probably, but I do think the main point still stands. John felt at home in the forest. He wasn't scared of being alone, and with his prowess as a sharpshooter, he was more than able to take care of himself. A set of skills that would soon cause even his own neighbors to recoil in fear. More on that in a bit, but for now, John was simply a backwoods hermit. That said, life would toss him a series of curveballs, first being a little something known as Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever. If you're not familiar, Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever, also known as black measles, is a tick-borne illness that, if left untreated, can cause some pretty severe complications, up to and including nerve damage, hearing loss, paralysis, gangrene, and even organ failure. It also had a very high mortality rate. And considering that penicillin had not yet been discovered, there really wasn't much that the doctors could do. They made sure that John was given plenty of fluids, they applied various ointments to his rashes, put him on bed rest, stuff like that. And luckily for him, he was able to pull through. Just not unscathed. Not only would John bear the scars for the rest of his life, but he also would receive some pretty significant neurological damage. Whether or not this affected his cognitive abilities, I really can't say, but it did leave him with a speech impediment, which in his mind was all the more reason to escape even further into the wilderness. He would emerge on occasion, though. Sometimes he'd join his brothers working for logging companies. Sometimes he'd help out his parents on the farm with the planting and harvesting. And sometimes he just wanted to visit his beloved sister, Minnie. Remember, she had gotten married several years prior to a guy by the name of Henry Bauer. They had a daughter, Mary, who was born in 1896. Then, just a few years later, a set of twin boys, Will and John. And for a while, Minnie and her growing family seemed to be the only bright spot in John Tornow's orbit. Especially the boys. He instilled in them the very same love for the forest that he received from Minnie. Taught them how to handle guns, how to track animals, how to fish and hunt. All that kind of good stuff. Basically the sort of uncle that every kid wants if you're more interested in living off the land and learning calculus. Sadly, John's relationship with his brothers, especially little brother Ed, was the exact opposite. Now, this is where things start to get a little hard to separate the fact from the fiction, but legend has it that Ed shot and killed one of John's favorite dogs. And in turn, John killed one of Ed's favorite dogs. A little tit for tit, as Michael Scott would say. He then told his brother that he was going off alone to live in the wilderness, and for him not to try to stop him. He even went so far as to say that if Ed or anyone else tried coming after him, then he'd kill him. So yeah, right off the bat, things just took a very drastic turn. That said, I'm not really sure things went down exactly as the legend states. As you'll soon hear, much of what we think we know about John Tornow was either exaggerated or simply made up out of thin air following his death. The newspapers especially would make him out to be a monster, and in the years that followed, his story has snowballed to mythical proportions. Regardless of whether the dog incident truly occurred, we do know that tragedy struck again in 1909. And trust me when I say this is where things are really gonna go off the rails. It all began when John's father passed away on August 12th. This was followed by his 71-year-old mother breaking her hip. And then, if that's not bad enough, John's brother Ed, remember him? Well, he went ahead and impregnated his own niece. Yeah, his own niece. Now, this young lady's name was Mary. She was the daughter of John's sister Minnie, and she had come to live with the grandmother after she had broken her hip. I guess one thing led to another, and she and Uncle Ed began hooking up. But wait, there's more. Now, as bad as all that is, Mary herself would die on December 2nd, 1909, following a botched abortion. Then the following November, John's mother Louisa would also pass away. All of this occurred over the span of around 18 months, by the way. And here's the kicker. John's parents had owned several hundred acres of farmland. And once his mother had finally passed away, it was revealed that she had left it all to John. As I'm sure you can imagine, his brothers weren't all that happy about this latest development. Ed, the niece fucker, was especially hoping to cut his brother out entirely, to the point that he actually tried to have John committed to an insane asylum. He filed the paperwork with the sheriff, and the sheriff did locate John out in the forest. He even hung out with him for a while, just talking. And then when he got back to town, he basically told Ed, "Hey man, your brother's not crazy. He just wants to be left alone." But Ed wouldn't let it be. He may not have been able to have John institutionalized, but he did start spreading rumors. And to this day, despite there not being a shred of evidence to back it up, there are many who still believe that John did indeed escape from that insane asylum. Not only did it never happen, but he was never even committed in the first place. Now, I have no way of proving this next part, but I'm willing to bet the story about him vowing to kill anyone who came looking for him also stemmed from his brother Ed. Either way, the rumors were so persistent that many of John's own neighbors started thinking that he was a dangerous lunatic. And just to be clear before we go any further, I am not saying that John wasn't crazy, okay? He very well may have had a few screws loose. In fact, I do think it's likely. And as we're about to find out, he was most definitely dangerous. But at the same time, it's also true that there was a concerted effort to label him as a psychopath, even before the killing began. Just want to toss that out there. Hey, we'll get back to the story in just a moment, but today's episode is brought to you by the Wild West Extravaganza Patreon. But Josh, what is a Patreon? Long story short, it's a subscription-based platform that allows you to directly support shows just like mine. As it currently stands, there's only one tier. It's just $5 a month, and that gives you both early and ad-free access to the entire back catalog of the Wild West Extravaganza. No more commercials, you get each new episode before anyone else, and you get to listen to the really early, embarrassing stuff. And on top of all of that, you'll have the peace of mind knowing that 20% of every dollar goes directly to charity. And yes, I do post the receipts right there on Patreon. You'll also get bonus content. Remember that talk I had recently with James Townsend from the Billy the Kid Historical Coalition, talking all about J. Frank Dalton, that Jesse James impersonator? Well, we had a similar discussion recently about a little someone known as Beaver Smith. Yes, that Beaver Smith, crusty old saloon owner from Young Guns 2. Turns out he was a very real person. Not only that, but James was even able to determine his true identity. We also spoke about his life before and after Billy the Kid, and we veered into probably at least a dozen other topics. It was a really fun talk, and it is only available on Patreon. And yeah, I do plan on adding additional discussions. Oh, gotta fix my mustache. In the very near future. I also have a new series where I'm narrating the biography of George W. Coe. If you're not familiar, George W. Coe was a major player in the Lincoln County and Colfax County wars. Matter of fact, speaking of young guns, remember that scene where they get to the gunfight with Buckshot Roberts? Well, George Coe lost his finger in that fight. Dude lived a very long time. He knew a lot of people, not just Billy the Kid, but even gunfighters like Clay Allison. And he shared his story later on in life in a book titled Frontier Fighter. And if you'd like to hear what he had to say in my voice, that too is a Patreon exclusive. Here's the catch though. On September 15th, I am changing the $5 tier. Or to be more specific, I will be adding extra tiers with additional perks. If you're already a member of the Patreon, this will not affect you whatsoever. You'll be grandfathered in at just $5 a month for however long you choose to remain a member. And you'll still have access to everything. For everyone else though, if you want to get locked in, you've got until September 15th. And you can get locked in right this second by heading on over to patreon.com/Wild West Extra. By the way, if you're not sure how to use Patreon, just hit me up and I'll guide you through it. It's super easy. You can still listen to each and every episode on your preferred podcast player of choice, at least most podcast players. And I am currently in the process of setting it up so that from now on, every video will also be viewable on YouTube, okay? You won't have to watch the videos on the Patreon app itself. You'll have to go through Patreon, and it'll transfer you to YouTube with the click of a button. No muss, no fuss. Easy peasy. So what are you waiting on? Head on over to patreon.com/Wild West Extra to get locked in at just $5 per month. No more commercials. That is patreon.com/Wild West Extra. All right, let's get back to the show. And yeah, that being the case, as the months passed and the rumors continued to swirl, John faded deeper and deeper into the forest. About the only contact he had with the outside world was his sister Minnie, and even that was growing increasingly rare. He'd sneak in her house every now and then, sometimes sleeping in the night for a bite to eat, but that's about it. That's all that remained of his connection to his family, and even that was hanging on by a mere thread. Then, tragically, in September of 1911, the unimaginable happened. The Bauer twins, the same nephews that John had taught how to hunt and fish, well, they set off to deal with a bear that had been raiding the family's cattle. By the next morning, they still hadn't returned home, so a search party went out looking. Sure enough, the boys were dead, both of them having received a single gunshot wound to the chest and buried in a shallow grave. Now, what exactly occurred is still up for debate. Some claim that the twins were aiming at the bear halfway up the slope, not realizing that their uncle had a camp on top. And then, when one of their bullets tore past his tent, John, thinking he was under attack, returned fire, without knowing who he was shooting at. Then again, there are other stories claiming that the boys were purposely shooting at John, and he fired back just defending himself. And then, of course, there's the theory that John had nothing to do with it, that it was the boy's father who killed him. Now, here's the interesting part. There was a dead bear found nearby, along with several of the boys' bullets lodged in the cedar tree, so we do know they really were out hunting for bear. Also, they were buried in a very careful manner, with their eyelids shut and their arms crossed, almost as if whoever killed them regretted his actions. But accident or not, by sundown, John Tornow was no longer just a family outcast. He was now suspect number one, and forevermore known as the Wild Man of the Wynoochee. As far as the public was concerned, he was nothing more than a rabid dog who needed to be put down. Due process be damned. With the twins dead, the manhunt began in earnest. Lawmen, bounty hunters, and every would-be tough guy west of the Cascades all wanted a piece of that $3,000 reward. Which, to be fair, was some pretty serious money back in those days. More than enough to send whole entire posses crashing through the brush. Only thing is, John Tornow proved to be quite the slippery eel, always managing to stay a couple of steps ahead of his pursuers. As winter set in, the frustration continued to grow. And then finally, in early 1912, a break seemed to come when a trapper named Lewis Blair found an elk carcass. He reported it to Deputy Colin McKenzie and a game warden by the name of Al Elmer, and with bloodhounds in tow, they set out to track down the elusive wild man. And they never returned. Search party that went out looking found both of the men shot dead, their bodies laid out in a T for Tornow in a shallow grave. Cue the hysteria. The reward money jumped to a small fortune, entire towns went on lockdown, and every shadow and snapped twig turned into a positive sighting. Hell, things got so heated that a trigger-happy hunter accidentally shot a teenage boy just thinking he was Tornow. Meanwhile, the press was having an absolute field day, labeling John as a monster with dead black eyes who had the stealth of a panther. And yet, through it all, he continued to elude capture. By the spring of 1912, the manhunt dragged on for nearly 2 years. Patience was wearing thin, and just about everyone there in Grays Harbor and Mason County had an opinion, usually a loud one, about how it ought to end. But as luck would have it, a local sheriff received a tip concerning Tornow's whereabouts. In turn, he called a Deputy Giles Quimby, who wasted no time in rounding up 2 of the best trackers in the area, Charles Lathrop and Lewis Blair. And yeah, this is the same Blair who tipped off authorities to that elk carcass. The 3 men then headed quietly into the Wynoochee in May of 1919, hoping to finally put an end to the longest manhunt Western Washington had ever seen. But once again, John was ready. He heard him approaching his hideout and opened fire, killing both Blair and Lathrop. Quimby, startled by the gunfire, began emptying his revolver into the brush as he bolted for town. And lo and behold, by the time they returned with backup, they found Tornow dead. And even in his death, he remained a mystery. While most do think he was indeed killed by a bullet from Quimby, others claim that John did himself in by ingesting strychnine. Whatever the true cause of death, everyone did agree that John looked more like a gorilla than a human. Tall and bearded and broad, with what seemed like a lifetime of hard living carved into his very being. Even Deputy Quimby claimed that Tornow's face was the most terrible he had ever seen. News spread fast, and by the time they hauled John's body to the nearest town, there were a ton of people waiting. In fact, they ended up storming the morgue and grabbing whatever souvenirs they could get their hands on. Locks of hair, scraps of clothing, even pieces of the table where John's body was lying. In the end, the coroner had no choice but to let the mob through single file, just to satisfy their morbid curiosity. In just a half an hour, more than 600 people shuffled through just to get a glimpse of Tornow's corpse. What remained of his family would end up holding an early morning funeral there on the family homestead the following day, posting guards around the grave just to dissuade any 2-legged scavengers. Of course, by that point, folks were already selling photos of Tornow's body as well as relics from his cabin. Meanwhile, the people who helped chase him became minor celebrities. Sheriff declared victory, the newspaper celebrated, and the locals breathed a sigh of relief. The wild man of the Wynoochee was finally dead, and at long last they could stop jumping at shadows. And I do think it's very tempting to write Tornow off as a psycho, just some sort of a backwoods monster lurking in the forest. And to be fair, that is the story that the papers chose to run with. A hairy and savage madman capable of God only knows what. And that being the case, that's the story that we're now familiar with. In their defense, though, the facts don't exactly paint the rosiest of pictures, right? After all, 6 people were dead, 2 of whom were John's own nephews, which we still don't know who the true killer was. And all that remained was a family torn apart by suspicion, scandal, and just plain old bad luck. Now, if you're interested in paying your respects, you can visit John's grave and see the headstone that was placed there years later by strangers. There are even shrines in the little clearing where he died, framed with elk antlers and old photographs. Visitors leave trinkets, cartridges, and even notes in a logbook, paying their respects not only to a criminal, but to a legend. Plays, books, and even an old silent film have kept John's story alive. And each new telling picks a side. He's invariably viewed as a rabid beast, or sometimes just a misunderstood loner. But what do you think? Did he really kill his nephews? And if so, was it on accident, or was his mind simply broken? Was John Tornow the villain that the papers made him out to be, or just another casualty of a family and a world that wouldn't let him alone? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because I am genuinely interested to hear what you have to say. And yeah, I guess that's about all I've got on the wild man of the Wynoochee. Okay, till next time, be nice to one another, and adios.